Without further ado, then, I would like to welcome our first speaker, Professor Timothy Barrett from SOAS. Timothy Barrett is Professor Emeritus of East Asian History at SOAS, University of London, where he taught from 1986 to 2013, primarily covering Chinese religious history, on which he has published several books, besides some further publications on the reception of the Chinese tradition in Europe. A graduate of Cambridge with a doctorate in religious studies from Yale, he had earlier taught in Chinese studies at Cambridge for over a decade. Please welcome Timothy Barrett. It looks like you just... Oh, right, of course, yeah.
Okay. Just going to wave my arms a bit, that's all. I've been having a tickle in my throat for the past week or so, so I should make sure I got something to sip just in case, but so far so good. And in any case, I'm just the background man, I'm the historian. I call this the story so far, because that's all it is. And not much of the story, because as we know, China's not really important till it's observed by white males. So we only have to go back to the 16th century. Well, okay, I'll admit that the Daode jing that we've already been introduced to is a lot older than that. Shall we say, it's attributed to a figure of the 6th century. We now have very early versions of the text, but we didn't until quite recently. But it seems quite clear that it's a work that at the latest will go back to in the form that we have it, will go back to the 3rd century BCE and obviously has earlier antecedents. But forget all that, because when the first Catholic missionaries arrived, what they saw was an ancient tradition which supported this text, that we know as Daoism, which was at that time, when they arrived in the 16th century, quite important. It had a strong imperial patronage. The missionaries don't seem to have taken to it. One thing that I think they found disturbing, it's just a guess, is that the priesthood of Daoism is not necessarily celibate. And here are these guys who come over from Europe to make good the inroads that Lutheranism had made in their own little flock, and there they find there's a bunch of non-celibate priests in China as well. So probably they didn't take kindly to that. There's also the fact that patronage did not persist because the Manchus who came in the mid-17th century tended to use Buddhism a lot more. Their own religion was shamanic from the northeast of Asia, but since they were constructing a international empire, Buddhism was much more useful to their purposes rather than a solely Chinese tradition like Daoism. Anyhow, there the missionaries decided that probably the best guy to concentrate on then was Confucius. So you learn a lot about Confucius in 17th century sources. But one of the things that's going on is, of course, you have to remember that to everybody before the 19th century, and even, shall we say, before the 20th century, everybody assumed in Europe that our history was actually quite short, because they assumed a biblical history going back to tracing things backwards, the Tower of Babel, which is the last time when everybody spoke the same language, the flood and Noah, you know, that's when the earth had to be repeopled, and then back to the Garden of Eden and so forth. So there was this assumption that if China is very ancient, maybe there is some kind of reminiscence of true knowledge of the Garden of Eden and that kind of thing back in early Chinese sources. So the missionaries start looking at these and imagining that they find, for example, monotheism in early China, which is not unproblematic. But then they see that in this Daode jing there are actually some passages which could be construed as possible references to the Judeo-Christian tradition. So they start to pay a bit more attention in the 18th century, start to translate it into Latin, of course. Doesn't get much circulated because it's only a fringe movement that are really into this ancient stuff. And then, of course, nothing much happens until the 19th century, when there's a revolution in France, I understand. You get, instead of this Catholic sinology, you get a more secular type of sinology, and you get the first translation in the 1840s of the Daode Jing, where the French professor actually starts to show some interest in what the Chinese might have made of all this, without reference to Christianity or anything. And it's this that tends to get picked up first in England, because it's a very good translation, and it, as it were, gets reproduced without all the footnotes. French have too many footnotes, and not a very Anglo-Saxon thing. That's the beginning of the Daode Jing in the English language. And the problem is that not many people are involved, and there are mainly two types of chap. They're all male. One sort of chap is the missionary, and unfortunately, his business is not to understand China, but to change it. You'll find that the Protestant missions are much less interested in this sort of antique stuff. You know, they believe in the Garden of Eden and all of that, but that's not what they're up to. There are all kinds of differences I could go into there, and we might talk about later. That's one sort of chap. The other is the consul with a bit of spare time. You get a whole, because of imperialism, you get a whole system of consuls deposited in China, inadequately trained as it happens, because they're just told to learn Chinese. And then they're supposed to support British commerce. But of course, they've gone to decent public schools, and they know a lot of Latin and Greek, but they don't know anything about commerce. So the entire system of British consuls in China, not very efficient. Not only that, but they have this tendency to take to drink, or go mad, or die prematurely of disease. So it's quite wasteful, but one or two of them, you know, actually do some useful work. And the cream of the crop here is a Herbert Giles. If you're in Taipei, for example, go up to Danshui and look at the place where he was consul, and it still preserves his family dining room. He was very anti-missionary. His father had been a clergyman. And so whereas the great missionary translator James Lebb does provide you with, as we've already discovered, with a decent translation of some Daoist works, old Giles is a bit of a contrarian, and he says, "Oh, actually, I don't believe that what's allowed, so I don't think this stuff is genuine." So he spent his time trying to trash that achievement. But he had a son who'd been brought up, obviously, in a Chinese-speaking environment. His Chinese is pretty good. And he was much more conciliatory than his father. Lionel is the sort of conciliatory, low-key kind of guy who becomes a librarian. He became a librarian, British Library, and he was the one who did the translating of the Daode Jing and a lot of other stuff. But there was virtually nobody else. What's going on? Well, you know, consuls, there were one or two other consuls, but as I said, the attrition rate is pretty high, so mainly what you're getting is ex-missionaries. And the missionaries, pretty good Chinese in many cases, but this is not their thing at all. Also, you know, in Britain, by the 1890s, they'd realised that their whole setup, especially as compared to the Germans, was utterly calamitous. They actually had to send out, what was his name? His name, well, Admiral Sir Charles Beresford, that's him. You want to know about British imperialism quickly? Read a poem called Lampada Vitae, which is set in a British public school. And first of all, you see the young chap at the school coming in. He's 10 runs to make and the last man in, but he's got to play the game. And then the scene switches, and there's a desperate battle in some colonial possession. I mean, and the verse starts with, "The Gatling's jammed and the Colonel's dead." But anyhow, the schoolboy has to play up and play the game and rally the troops, and of course they're successful despite the jammed Gatling and the dead Colonel. Old Beresford actually was trapped in that situation once. So he had to duck under the Gatling's carriage to get away from being stabbed. He was very interesting guy. I'm wandering off the topic, but whatever. A man of parts, I would say. He was on a naval tour of the Pacific and fell in love with a lady called Nancy Wahine Kapusumna, of Tahitian, Hawaiian and American descent. Alas, they decided that Victorian Britain just wasn't going to go for that. So they never married. But obviously, this is a guy who's fairly broad-minded and brave. He came back he was sent out to China because British commerce was losing hands down to the Germans, and they wanted to know why. And so he went out and took a look. He said, maybe we ought to try learning Chinese. Also, all these public school boys, they don't know anything about business. Of course, we're not going to give them degrees in economics. Gentlemen don't do that. But they might perhaps study something practical like law. And of course, there's nobody teaching, certainly nobody teaching Chinese law. So, the entire academic effort in Britain, there were one or two exciting near misses. Like at the time of the founding of SOAS, Chinese teaching in London University, which was much better established than Oxbridge, had been consolidated in King's. And that fell vacant at the time that King's was about to be absorbed into SOAS. So they looked around for somebody to fill the post, and they had a brilliant idea. They thought, we'll ask Sir Edmund Backhouse. Has anybody heard of Sir Edmund Backhouse? Well, he turned out to be a pornographer and a forger. But in those days, he was able to bluff his way.
Academia was different then.
He was up to no good, and he was actually angling for the professorship at Oxford. So although he was appointed to this professorship that would have got SOAS at least off to an interesting start, he never showed up. He didn't get the job at Oxford either. So it took them some time. It's only in the 1920s they found a missionary. I mean, the qualifications for being a professor of Chinese were pretty basic in those days. You've got to know Chinese pretty well, and they certainly did if they were missionaries, and you've got to have written a book. So originally they found a guy, a Welshman, very good Welshman, who knew Chinese, but he hadn't written a book. Or possibly he'd written one in Welsh, but that didn't count. So they had to wait until they found somebody who was a missionary, knew Chinese, and written a book, and that was in the 1920s. So basically, we're not getting much in the way of anything about that Chinese culture from this lot. So what this means is that others are able to step in. And who steps in? I call them free agents of the spirit. The most prominent are the followers of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. Some nodding of heads here. Have we heard of the wonderful Helena Petrovna Blavatsky? She was the founder of Theosophism. She claimed to have been hanging out with Mahatmas in Tibet and stuff like that, and have revelations. And she was immensely successful. Let's give her some credit. Although people have had doubts from quite early on about where she was getting this stuff from, and I do have a friend who was working on some unusual materials in the British Library, which seem to be the clue to this all. She had this photographic memory, eidetic memory, so if she'd read some stuff in the British Library, she didn't have to carry it around with her. She could work on it, and she came up with some interesting, if wacky stuff. And where am I? Okay, she's been successful. She's actually, what's interesting is that this does give some credit to Asians. Okay, if you're hanging out with Mahatmas, at least they're not Anglo-Saxons or even Russian. Here for the first time we get a willingness to read ancient Chinese texts in a way that is a bit creative, but and they don't really, and none of her translators in this tradition tend to know much Chinese, they often know some. And the thing is that they feel that, why bother with the Chinese commentaries? It's a corrupt tradition in China. These Daoists, they are just, this priesthood, obviously, degenerate over the course of time. So how are we going to understand this stuff? We're going to understand it through our knowledge of mysticism. And we know a lot about mysticism because we've read all kind of mystic stuff. We've read some Persian mysticism, some Sanskrit mysticism, a ton of mysticism. And Madame Blavatsky has added in a lot more from her Mahatma friends. So in the light of this universal mysticism, we are going to reconstrue this text and tell you all the stuff that the Chinese themselves don't know about. So you get at least half a dozen translations in this tradition. And the only problem to me is that, okay, if you're telling us that because of your wonderful knowledge of mysticism in a lot of cultures, you're better off than the Chinese, I think Edward Said had a word for this. And I think it was Orientalism, we know a lot better than you lot. And this tends to develop to almost ridiculous extent, where Chinese commentators are being completely trashed as misguided, degenerate, whatever, and these guys are taking off into, what should we say, into the stratosphere if we talk about the search for universal values, okay, that's in a sense what's going on, but it's kind of not very tethered to reality very much. So this is pretty desperate. And clearly one or two Chinese twigged what was going on, or not just Chinese, but certainly Chinese. In 1947, the poet and critic William Empson, he spent some time in China. He had some Chinese friends, good guys. And in 1947, one of them points out, look, there's Arthur Waley. Arthur Waley was actually, in the materials I circulated, is one of the better translators. He actually seriously worries about what this may have meant in early China. And he's not simply going with the commentary. He's trying, with a knowledge as it existed in that time, what early China was like, trying to say, well, this is probably what the text is talking about. But the Chinese guy says, Arthur Waley, still a bit woo-woo, if you know what I mean. That's not the term he used in 1947. But what he's saying is that, this is making us Chinese all a bit passive and quietistic and blah-de-blah. And Waley is the best of them. So this tradition of reading, it's not only this, it's in 1960s, there was a French scholar called Henri Maspero, who was a very early student of Daoism taken as a whole, including all the material from the Daoist priestly tradition. He was the first to really look at it seriously. And he had an idea about the Daode Jing, which was a bit similar, and he said mysticism. So it so happened that the Japanese were studying this tradition about the same time as he was and reading the same materials, largely because they were in China already for other purposes. So by the 1960s, they got that behind them. But they're saying, mysticism, we never thought of that. In other words, to them, looking at it through the Japanese tradition, Daode Jing is not about mysticism. It's quite a practical text. And indeed, there had been, like early 9th century, was a text which reads the Daode Jing as good advice for any general. It's a kind of art of war interpretation of Daode Jing. Down the line practical stuff. But having mentioned the Japanese, something very interesting happened in the 1890s. Remember, Japan is going through this, universal values, modernization, blah, de blah, de blah, that we're all talking about already. In 1894, was it, or 96, the 1890s, along comes a geographer. You don't expect much of geographers, sorry. But he's a guy called Shigehisa. Not very well known today, but absolutely crucial to understanding developments in Japan and indeed elsewhere. He writes a book about Japanese geography. It's a technical geography of Japan. The climate is this, the volcanoes are here, but it's spliced in with a lot of Japanese literature, the cherry blossom, that kind of stuff. And it's a sensation, because what it is it's turning the attention of Japan to nature, understood from a modern point of view, but still validating, because there is a lot of nature in Japanese literature. Frogs jump into wells, all the time. What she's saying, yes, we Japanese, we're into nature. But we can do it in a modern scientific way. Forget the sacred mountains and that kind of stuff. You forget the shrines, the temples, all of that. This is down the line modern geography, but he's spliced it together with a love of nature, and this is where the Japanese win. He's a familiar already with, Emerson and Wordsworth, the Romantics, the Transcendentals. All this stuff was flooding into Japan, and they knew all their Western mysticism and nature poetry and that. But he said, we got it already, and it's better than anybody else's. But what is nature in Japanese? The word is shizen, okay, which is just ziran. How we translate that, I'm not going to translate that. But if you look at this, it's in the Daode Jing. It's not in any Confucian classics I've been able to find. You've got to go to the Daode Jing to find this key term. And it can be translated nature, I guess. Arthur Waley translated it literally as the self-so. So I've tried doing that, and copy editors pick it up immediately and say, that's nonsense. When you try and get the words of an ancient sage, the Chicago Manual of Style clamps down immediately. No, not. So I don't know how to translate it, but anyhow, it's foregrounded by Shiga's work. Okay. Now it just so happens that there was another current in Japan that was coming on big in the 1890s, even from a bit earlier. I hesitate to mention this because it's ineffable. In other words, I can't talk about it. It's called Zen. Okay? Yeah. And this is a part of the inherited Buddhist tradition, but it looks kind of interesting. One thing is it's quite inward, and the big threat in Japan at this time was Protestant Christianity. So we got something that can do the same, and not only that, but if you look at, there's probably one guy you have heard of in relation to the propagation of Zen in the West. You'd have to be about my age to really feel the effects of this. His name was D.T. Suzuki. Okay, yeah? Okay, he's a young man in the 1890s. He's already read Emerson and says, "Oh, Emerson's a bit Zen," then he has to wait quite a long time. He says, I need to bring Zen to the West. I know English pretty well. Everybody at least agrees on that. I want to go to America, but I want to be enlightened first. So he delays going to America until he has an enlightenment experience. He's training at a Zen monastery. It's not one of the traditional ones. It's one in Kamakura that's more open to lay people, intellectuals and that, and a lot of intellectuals actually go there. So he's training up under the influence of this place, and he's coming back from the meditation hall one evening, and the moon is shining, and suddenly he is one with the trees, and the trees are one with him. And he realizes he's got the enlightenment. What's interesting about this is that there's a lot of shizen in there, which is timely. And then what happens? He says, "I'm enlightened," and he goes to work in America for a German-American philosopher called Paul Carus. What does he do there? He translates the Daode Jing. Okay. Carus, of course, puts the thing out under his name. And it's not until 1999 that, as far as I can see, that anybody actually admits that the translation is by Suzuki. But anyhow, that's it. So I'm going to stop because this is the point where I really need to do more work, and I will for a conference later this summer, which is after the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902, this stuff starts to come into Britain. And you've got a lot of nature, a lot of Zen, and you've got Laozi and the Daode Jing coming in together with it. And you get people, proponents of East Asian culture like Okapura Tenshin, what's the name of the guy who does Lucaria Kaiten, who does The Religion of the Samurai. Then you get Ernest Fenollosa, brings in Chinese poetry and so forth, but also a lot of art, and art criticism. You get Lawrence Binion at the British Museum, blah de blah de blah. I need to look at all that stuff again. Certainly, I've already looked at this stuff in relation to the appearance of the concept of Zen art, which is certainly a rise in Britain by the beginning of the 1920s, from this kind of background. Okay, but I need to look at it all again. So that's as much as I know today, folks, and that's all I'm going to say. Okay.
So we have about 10. We have about like 8-10 minutes for questions.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to first kind of have a short discussion with you about Ziran and stuff, because I feel like it's just like the way it is. Maybe it will be accurate in a sense.
Well, okay. Yeah, that's a good translation. I mean, I've looked around and people translate it. Even it's mentioned about 4 or 5 times in the Daode Jing, and people don't always translate it the same way in the same place.
Yeah, exactly.
1 or 2 places it's quite prominent, like where the Tao models itself on Ziran. What? Your translation is good. I mean, I looked around, and the one I liked best was by a guy called Edmund Ryden. I've told you there weren't many Anglo translators way back when, but there are none now. Most of the translators into English are based in North America. Edmund Ryden is as close to an Anglo translator as we can get. He's actually a Portuguese Jesuit, but hey, at least he sounds like an Englishman. And I thought his translation was good, and it's a bit like yours. I can't remember what it was. But the problem is that this is one of those key terms that gets interpreted and reinterpreted all the time. There's a time which I find very interesting. It's not for it's not part of China that people are bothered about because it's before the 16th century, where Buddhists and Daoists are arguing the toss about Ziran versus karma. You know, and the Buddhists are saying this Ziran concept, it's amoral. So we believe in karma, and we believe that you know, folks ought to be doing good. You believe that the world is just created in a totally amoral way. So this, in this context, to say Ziran versus karma, I think what people normally translate in that context is spontaneity.
I'm against this concept, this translation, to be honest. I see there is a point, but it's kind of...
Yeah, I mean, what I'm saying is that you have to look at the context in which you're using it, you know. So I don't think there's a one size fits all. And so I think that's enough for now, right? I take your point, yes.
Just one question. So do you look into the vorticist movement in their understanding?
I'd love to.
Yeah.
Wyndham Lewis. You know Wyndham Lewis wrote about feng shui?
Exactly.
Wow.
Last one.
Yes. And nobody looks at it. Go ahead.
Yeah.
But of course, and what's going on at that point is people are sort of shadow boxing with Ezra Pound, right?
Yeah.
And Ezra Pound is doesn't know Chinese, but again, the stuff he's getting is via Penelosa and is influenced by Japanese interpretations of poems, blah 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 blah. Waley probably had a lot of Japanese help at first of reading the poems. But at least he tends to treat Chinese texts on their own terms once he's learned how to. But yeah, Wyndham Lewis, I would love to see something written about Wyndham Lewis. Please go ahead, yeah?
Thank you.
Okay.
Question? Yes.
Yeah.
I have me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. I have a question. This is really your presentation and Julia's presentation have really got me thinking about what it means to do a good interpretation, or what is a good use of a text like the Daoist.
We'll come back to this.
Yeah, I think we will. But I wanted to ask a specific question about the dating of the Daode Jing, because I know that for a long time, and I even show this picture to my students when I'm teaching the Daode Jing. It was believed that Confucius learned everything that he needed to know from Laozi, right?
Yeah,
and so this idea that Laozi was like the real old master, and then Confucius, and then everything else in the preaching period. And now, as you said, we have evidence that it might be actually later, which influences how we interpret the Daode Jing.
Later in the form in which we have it.
Yes. So one question I wanted to ask you is, do you think that makes a difference in terms of the sequencing of debate in the Warring States period, or how it is we in the present are meant to interpret the Daode Jing on its own terms when we're not even sure when it comes when it comes out or when it emerges?
If you're Madame Blavatsky, this doesn't bother you because it's all the same, 600, 300, 400, whatever, it's all woo-woo. As I suggested.
I'm not
okay, you're not. Okay, you're interested in history.
A little bit.
How it's tedious.
Yeah.
Okay. The problem with it is, I think I avoid it because I think the early China people have not settled down in their interpretation. It's in the 1990s that the latest material came out, it's not just a question of having a new textual material. It's a question of how do we understand the world of thought that produced this. And I think there's some rethinking going on. Michael Pruitt at Harvard, for example, Ted Slingerland at UBC. I'm not sure that they've got all the answers, but maybe a consensus will emerge. But it's not my field, and I'm staying well out of it myself. Yeah, but it's clear that I mean, one interesting thing, there is so much new material that's been dug up that a lot of rethinking is possible. A lot of rethinking is possible about political philosophy. And that is really interesting. It's like Dead Sea Scrolls, right? You can think, we thought old China was like this, but hey, we've discovered this new stuff. Which maybe has implications of political philosophy as well. But, that's not my, as historians say, that's not my period.
Yeah, that's
right.
Not mine either.
Yeah. How about from here? Any questions? Oh, sorry. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Thank you for your wonderful lecture, and I think it's very clear from your lecture about who translated Daode Jing over time, and I wonder whether you can elaborate a little bit more about how people receive these translated works of Daode Jing.
Yeah, that's a fascinating area that has not really been studied. We've got some examples from Germany. We know who read the translation. We know that William Empson read Arthur Waley's translation. We know Bertrand Russell read quite a lot of early Chinese translation by Giles. Interesting stuff. But in fact, that's only just beginning. I find, for example, that in Cambridge, as well as Russell, there are other people. I happen to know very slightly I.A. Richards, the literary critic, because I went to school with his great nieces and his great nephews as well. I knew quite well because they lived quite close. So I've looked a bit at I.A. Richards because I got some kind of sense of what his background was. Blah blah blah. He in the 1910s they were really into Chinese stuff as other people in Cambridge, but it's Confucian. They're looking at Confucian texts. And that's what they're going for, unlike the Germans. I had a Dutch teacher, and I'm sorry if there's anybody German here, but his opinion of the Germans was not good. I mean, he'd been in the Dutch resistance, and he said, it's all to do with their mother fixation. That's why they go for Daoism, So whether that is true or not,
Julia can investigate that.
Whether that is true or not, I must say that the people making the running. I mean, Russell has some interesting quotations from Chinese literature, but the people making the running, as far as I can see, were mainly into Confucian texts. And that happens again when I.A. Richards is in China. Have you seen Mencius on the Mind? His book on, how do we understand a foreign text? It's for him, it's a big theoretical question, and he has his answers. But it's Mencius, it's not Laozi. Yeah?
Thank you.
I have just wanted to add to this. Like, Russell is particularly taken with Lionel Giles's translations and editions, and he first received his copy from some member of the Bloomsbury group while he was in prison. So he was sent.
So this is during the First World War.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So like the Bloomsbury group were circulating the Daoist texts specifically, but again, I don't. That's not my period.
It's because they're hanging out around the British Library, which is British Museum, British Library, same thing in those days, and that is where Lionel is. Also, I talked about. I mean, there are at least half a dozen Theosophist works from Theosophist publishers, but there's also, the publisher John Murray, who's quite respectable. It's a firm that goes back to the early 19th century. They had a series called The Wisdom of the East, and some of the stuff they publish is Theosophist. Some of the, they have quite a few publications by Lionel Giles included in that series. So there is some stuff coming in from one of the few reliable sources in London from that publication series. So that's where I think the Bloomsbury people are picking up that particular information.
And that's very not dissimilar to the German reception. Like as I was saying, like there's one publisher in Germany, Daoist, who's publishing the Wilhelm translations. They're beautiful, they're black and gold, and like they're in several people's libraries, and they keep being mentioned. They're sort of like collector's editions, sort of, but definitely propagated to the youth movement. So not dissimilar, except very different than his political history after that.
It's interesting that Giles Senior had very good contacts with Harwich, and that's in fact he. One reason for his success, and he did translate some Daoist stuff, even if not the Daoist jing, is that his academic, and he's not in London, he's in Cambridge, and that kind of keeps him out of the loop in some ways, but he's got good publishing contacts. Actually, his father had, because his father did a lot of hack work for publishers, publishing translations of Latin and Greek. So, and in fact, the fact that Giles can publish through a reputable press and get distributed means that his stuff is picked up by people like Oscar Wilde. You know, Oscar Wilde really thinks that Daoism is, there's a wonderful publication of Oscar Wilde's essay on Herbert Giles's translation, which was, it was originally in some journal, but a small press in Dublin republished it separately. And so, for a consideration, you can pick up a slim pamphlet that tells you exactly what Oscar Wilde thought about Daoism. And I think that it may be behind, we know that Sir Edmund Backhouse, the disreputable, was, when he was an undergraduate, he was a big fan of Oscar Wilde, and I think that's where he picks up his love of China, which meant he did go to China. He certainly did know Chinese very well. I do have a dictionary that Sir Edmund co-wrote, and there is no doubt that I mean, he was a slightly wacko individual, but he certainly knew Chinese, and the dictionary is quite good. And in fact, since it's originally published in the 1920s, you can look up Ziran in that dictionary, and you'll find he translates it as natural in some circumstances, but it's actually an English to Chinese dictionary. So if you look up nature, you don't get Ziran. If you look up in a modern contemporary Chinese dictionary, you look up nature and you get Ziran, but that seems to me to be Japanese influence. You know, if you look up Morrison's original English Chinese dictionary, it doesn't say Ziran at all for nature. It says Tiandi.
Indeed.
Yeah, Tiandi. Heaven and earth. Yeah. And there are other expressions which pressed into service, shall we say. But Ziran, it seems to me, is a Japanese discovery, and I point the finger at Shigehisa, the great geographer. I said enough, I think.
I think we need to remember. Thank you so much.